problem for Christianity is the idea that God became a man in Jesus. This is a late idea. It's not there in Jesus' ministry. It's only found actually in the Gospel of John. This is the last gospel to be written. In the earlier gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Mark's the earliest, there's no incarnation at all, and that's the least historical gospel of all, and that's the Gospel of John. So the bad news is the Gospel of John is used by Christians more than any other gospel to preach. For example, the American evangelist who I saw in London some years ago, he said, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And his scholars will say, no, he probably didn't say that. So that's not historical. And this is the scandal. Christians generally don't know about what their own scholars are saying about this.
Whoever wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not claim to be Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. Those are titles given to the books later by editors. The books themselves don't make any claim, so they're actually anonymous. And so in this case, these would be called false ascriptions rather than forgeries. But scholars for a long time have argued that they weren't really written by Matthew and John, two of Jesus' disciples, and Mark and Luke, companions of the apostles, that in fact the disciples of Jesus were probably Aramaic-speaking, illiterate peasants who couldn't write. These books are written in a very high-level Greek by people living 30 or 40 years later.
Do we know who actually wrote them?
We don't know. All we know is that they certainly were not the followers of Jesus, who spoke Aramaic and were lower-class peasants without an education. These books are written by highly educated Greeks, probably living outside of Palestine, 40 or 50 years later. But since they're anonymous, we really don't know who the authors were.
What's the evidence that these were not by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John? Is it just the fact that they were illiterate Aramaic speakers, or is there any other evidence?
That's a large part of the evidence. The other thing is that they aren't actually called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for over 100 years after they were written. And so church fathers at the end of the 2nd century, 100 years later, start calling them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But they were originally circulated anonymously, and they originally did not have titles in them, the Gospel according to Matthew. Whoever called it the Gospel according to Matthew was somebody telling you who, in his opinion, wrote the book. But his opinion was formed decades later, and so there's very little evidence to suggest that they were really written by the people that they're ascribed to.
Is there any evidence that each one was written by one person only? Because I have heard that the Gospels can be seen as collections of the memories of the early Christian communities about Jesus.
Yes, that's a really good point. Since these weren't written by eyewitnesses, and they don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses, so there's nothing spectacular about this kind of scholarship, but they're written by people 40 or 50 years later, and so you wonder, well, where did they get their information from? And the general thought among scholars is that Christians were telling stories about Jesus as they were trying to convert other people and trying to educate Christians, and these stories were in circulation year after year after year until these gospel writers, these anonymous individuals, heard the stories and then wrote them down. It may be that a couple of the Gospels actually had more than one author. For example, the Gospel of John, there are passages that don't look like they come from the same pen as the rest of the Gospel, and so there may be multiple authors in a couple of cases. One of the reasons that I've had trouble with traditional Christianity is because of the changes that scribes have made in the text, but it's not the only thing. Another issue is the internal discrepancies that you find within the New Testament and within the Bible, and I do know that the Quran has been faithfully transmitted over the centuries, and for some reason Christians decided not to transmit their book as faithfully. But what I would say is that they certainly could have if they had wanted to. There's not really not a lot to be done with the Quran, because so many of these manuscripts are just the same. So there's not a lot of scholarship to do, because with the New Testament, though, you have all these thousands of manuscripts that are all different from each other. And in the case of Muslim apologists, the idea is that the Quran doesn't have any of these problems, and therefore Islam is a superior religion. I'll tell you where I would agree. When it comes to the New Testament Gospels and the entire New Testament, we have many thousands of copies, and they do have lots and lots of differences among them. Hundreds of thousands of differences among our copies of the New Testament, but most of those differences are completely insignificant. Like, they don't matter for anything. We're counting like misspelled words and things like that. So they don't. But some of them do matter. They affect how you might understand a passage or a book or the entire New Testament. And the Quran's just not like that. Obviously, I mean, the Quran has been faithfully copied for many, many centuries.
To this day. To this day. To this day, you just sit here, you don't know what I'm talking about?
So that part is absolutely right.
Don't get it twisted. Okay? So don't get it twisted.
Everybody lick it.